Um, Thank you to both our presenters, Ndluli and Simnikiwe. And of course, I moderating this because it also speaks about the kind of work that I do in terms of Black artist biographies and the type of omissions and inaccuracies that have happened in South Africa's art historical narrative. And I want to maybe just as a way of a provocation, right, which is something I'm also struggling with, is how then do we insert, or do we need to insert these omissions into the overall, the bigger picture of the so-called South African art historical narrative? Do they need to be inserted in, and if so, how do we do that? Or is it a case that we start now mapping out very seriously and very rigorously a South African Black art history that starts to, I think, and not to be a counter to what's already established, right? But to unpick some of the things that you're talking about, Festec, right? To draw from there. I know that I sometimes also reference Festec using the Culture and Resistance Symposium that was then in 1982 in Gaborone in Botswana, which was more of a South African gathering. It had the same kind of feel of, visual artists, performers, theater, music, and the whole of South African arts cultural practitioners gathered in Gaborone in 1982. Yeah. So just as a point, that's point number one. And the second one, and I think that the first point also speaks to our, it's not here, our dear Goniwe. And he wrote an article once that was published in the South African Art magazine, titled "Blame It on the Art Historian." And there, Goniwe was really, he starts with the line that Colin Richards once said that the history of South African art is yet to be written. What we're reading right now is not an accurate representation of what South Africa's art historical narrative should be or can be, or how we can kind of start to imagine it, and what it would look like if the stories around Black artists are not this fragmented, displaced, yeah? When we start to put it together, how do we imagine doing that? So that's just a provocation that I think for all of us to think about. So I'm going to open up to the floor for you guys to ask questions. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Kwezi Kule. I have two comments. One is for Nkululeko, and the other one is for Simnikiwe. The one for Nkululeko is, I really appreciate the kind of detail that you have gone into, especially in terms of your relationship between yourself and Kamakulu, because a long time ago I did an exhibition with printmakers who had an association with Soweto at one point or another in their career, or who actually live in Soweto now. And these kinds of dynamics constantly come up. And for me, that brings up an issue around how those of us who are in paid jobs in public institutions ought to interact with or the kind of responsibility that we have to some of the people that have been historically erased and ignored. That's one point. The other point is that having given us all of this kind of rich texture of your interaction, I am somehow, of course I understand because of the time limitations, but I still feel somewhat deprived of your own curatorial thinking around the exhibition that you did at Point of Order, and how you sought to bring all of these things into a white cube and what your process was. So I'm intrigued by that aspect of your work, and I hope that maybe at some point you're going to elaborate on that. And then Simnikiwe, long time ago again, I went and interviewed a person called Mdluli, who in the 70s was part of a collective Mdluli Black Theatre. And he says, I didn't know this before he mentioned this, he says that Mdluli Black Theatre, which was included Wadiserote at the time and Tamimiele among others, did go to Festac 77. And that they were not supposed to be part of the program, but they went anyway. And basically they went there, and the thing that the person talks about the barriers and the soldiers and all of that, they said they encountered that. But remember, this was 1977, a year after the Soweto uprising. So the moment they said they were from Soweto, then all the doors opened for them. So I think that does provide a kind of counter-narrative to the one that the person you referred to has narrated. So I think that you should. I'll give you the context from Mdluli. I think it would be fascinating for you to hear from him around what his experience was.
Hello to the panel. So I have questions for both speakers. First
Name,
one is,
please.
Sorry?
Your name.
Oh, my name is Temba Tsotsi. My question for Nkululeko is, do you think curatorship is itself an art form? Also, do you as a curator, how much do you engage emotionally and intellectually in an exhibition? And for Simnikiwe, do you think Festac 77 represents the kind of alternative history, like in inverted commas, like in terms of that? Also myself, I've never heard of Festac 77. Do you think it represents a kind of alternative history where there are certain practices or events in the history of African art practice that are deliberately suppressed?
Can they respond, and then we'll take the other two? Yeah.
In terms of your comment, Kwesi, I'm glad that you actually did a Soweto print, because as well, speaking about Ukamakhulu, he actually also taught a Funda Center, which is something which is important because he was also a printmaker. But as well, you also spoke about the curatorial exhibition. I had slides on that, but they just vanished. But, not bad. However, yes, it was based on the archivals in terms of his drawings, his paintings, his prints, but also his books that he was written about. Like he had the books that I showed. Then he did illustrations of books, of children's books. So we had a cabinet of just archival materials regarding that. But at the same time, we also played old videos of his, because he also, I actually remembered when she was presenting that, he also did posters, because he's got a whole, posters that he has created out of his own artworks, out of the drawings, some of his students. So I think it's just a pity because of time, I was unable to show you that part of the curatorial project that I was speaking about. And then in terms of Utemba, you asked in terms of curatorship. Oh, sorry. Yeah, oh, okay. Temba, I think as well, in terms of curatorship, I think for me, personally, I like to engage with things that I can relate to, you know, that I'm passionate about. Yes, your question was that, curation in terms of art form. So for me, I think engaging, I'm going to use Ubabu Kamakulu for example, engaging with Ubabu Kamakulu every day. I think when I went to the point of order, I had a certain mindset of how I wanted to put the exhibition. But when I got there, I realized that how do I capture this man from the 70s till current, but yet he's got so much rich history, and he's got over 100 works of artworks that he collected from other people. So I just decided that I must not lose focus in terms of that. For me, his life already, it's a lot to engage with. But also looking at his body of works, you know, in terms of the paintings and the drawings, but also looking at the poster. Poster making is also a part of artworks. He also made T-shirts as well. But as well, looking at, we should not take away the videos that he also captured and other people also captured. So for me, I think it was a lot of work that I tried to put under one roof. Because I was telling somebody the other day that I can actually do probably another 5 shows of works that are not even exhibited out of just Ukamakulu, you know. So I just had to select what I felt it was working with the message that I was trying to send.
Okay, I'm going to respond to Kwezi first, actually. I'm going to try to dodge bullets. Such difficult questions. So, with the idea of the counter-narrative and those who did actually attend FESTEC, I'm actually just in conversation, just hearing you articulate your question. I'm noticing that there's slippages that even myself, that I'm going to start falling into in my research with FESTEC. And I don't know if that's owing to how much I really know about FESTEC in terms of how much I'm able to access in terms of the archive as it is. I think the Sonic is only one of many ways in which FESTEC exists. There's also many archives of FESTEC which are like located in Lagos, which have been untransferred, are in their most analog form, which we don't know what might be on there. So I think also in terms of the narratives that go beyond what we hear, what's been recorded, what's been written about. There's other narratives of people who attended, narratives of people who organized it, narratives of people who delivered the paper that was used to do this, and this, the narratives of people who cooked the food that was going to be eaten there. So I think slippages then starts to slip in here as well, in terms of how we read it, in terms of how I read it, in terms of how it has been recorded as it is. So I'm also interested in how, whether this is avoidable at this stage, or if the slippages are inevitable, that we're all going to fall into them. And if so, do we condone that? I don't think it should be okay that we're like falling into slippages just because we can't access the archive. I feel like that points to a greater question of how we should make the archive more accessible. And then to Temba's question about FESTEC existing as alternative event or histories. Here's the thing. So FESTEC 77 was a problem. It was essentially funded on oil money. Nigeria was going through an oil boom, an economic boom following the Biafran War. So it was basically a political project used by General Obasanjo to kind of sweeten up the effects of the Biafran War. It was a civil war that killed many people. So here's an opportunity, there's oil money, let's make a festival celebrating arts and cultural prowess of the entire continent. So to that degree, FESTEC will always exist as a problem. In terms of alternative event, I think there's even events that happen today as we speak that do exactly the same thing as FESTEC. I think what's significant about FESTEC particularly is the scale, and placing that scale in context of when it happened in the 70s, in post-independence, post-colonialism, bringing that many people to Lagos. They built the National Theatre, they built an auditorium just for FESTEC. They allocated land and they built FESTEC Town just for a festival, which, like I said, to locate that into space and time is quite significant. So I'm quite wary of the word alternative because it's alter from something else. I think FESTEC exists as a central point and a central narrative and should not ever exist on the peripheries of a larger art historical framework. And I'm going to bring that back to your question about how do we insert it? Should we insert it? I think
it depends on who's writing the narrative that we're trying to insert it into. Whereas if we establish our own narrative from scratch, we're not necessarily just trying to fit into something that's already been established, but we're building from ground up, from grassroots, something that pertains to our epistemological framework. Yeah.
There were 2 more questions.
My question is it's the same question to both of you. The part of the research I'm working on now is based on getting the true dates and timelines of local performers. It's mainly surrounding storytelling and umngokolo, which is a music genre performed by particularly women from Lady Frey in the Eastern Cape. And one of the things that stood out for me with Nkululeko talking about not knowing when Ubaba was born, one of the women I'm researching quite personally, we had to make up a date for and make up an ID for, because she doesn't have that concept of numbers, and her level of education is based on rural spacing and what you are taught by your grandparents, and not literary and not academic. So what my question is basically built and inspired by what Samir was asking you, is how now, as the literate and academically inclined Black women, Black educated young people, how do we ensure that that education doesn't just land up in these kind of discussions? How do we start infiltrating it into a space where schools aren't learning about Shakespeare? They're learning about Obaba Kunene, and they're learning about Maria Makeba in great detail, the way that we have to learn in great detail and break down what Romeo and Juliet is about. How would you feel your research is adding to that, obviously in the long term? Because right now we first need to infiltrate higher learning, which then builds more books, which then creates more spaces where Black people are writing about Black people. And you're not having someone, like one of the things I struggle with my lecturer is, and my supervisor, is that I would come back with information and he would argue it's based on a book that I'm saying, but this isn't true. I've just gone to that space. What they're talking about in this book isn't true. But this book is 30 years old and it's sold 500 million copies and it's all over the world. And this person is a renowned writer and she's from Europe. That can't be right. But the person himself is saying that this isn't right. How do we start changing those details? How do we start making our truth the truth and not an opinion?
My name is Morrison. I don't know is this a comment or a question, but it's directed to Nkululeko. I'm quite interested in what you have stated, like in terms of the history of VAL, and you also talked about the museum, the VAL Technorama, and what I think, like a few years back I saw a book that was written by Patrick Norman, whereby the name of the book is They Have Been in the Churches, and Patrick Norman was a Catholic priest, whereby he talk about history of the world and the events that happened back in the 80s, and also about the Shovel 6 that you have mentioned. And when I started photography in 2007, there was a time where I went to Val Technorama, and it was some sort of a wedding function whereby I saw the what do you call it, the gallery space. Hello.
Can you put it up?
I was saying, like when you find that the gallery space has turned into a place where people go to celebrate weddings and take pictures, and they use it as a reception, and also like when you say like Val has that strong history, and what do you think could be maybe a possibly way forward? And also to say, I don't know, should I say this is a fate, because back in 2007, you know, because I started photography in September. On January, between January and June, I was doing art and design in Stephen College, and I was one of your students. You were teaching us drawing and painting. After that, I just left in June. To come to photography. You know.
I'm Nkululeko Khumalo. Thank you to Simnikiwe and Nkululeko for the presentation, beautiful presentation. But also this is tied to what Usame. It's not so much of an answer, or I don't know, it's like just adding on basically. I think the problem that it's not even a problem, but I think also what you were asking or posing, it's more to do with the responsibility of a cultural worker working in this time now. Yeah. But also, are we, because a lot of the time there's a question of, are we responding to these things, these slippages, and what then is the role that we're doing now, but also more to do with the time that we're working in. And but I also think that the ethics around that also, because especially when it's to do with the biographies and all these things, but also I think ours basically, when we narrate or when we write, I think there's also this thing of not having to necessarily respond, but to write from a very ethical point of view, because I think at the same time we need to be able to account for the future, which is the now, you know. So because also this thing with, because I'm thinking of what Nkululeko was saying, a presentation. Yesterday I encountered a situation where, for instance, somebody is obliterating Nkululeko Khumalo in his presence, and this person is doing a postdoc on the work of Nkululeko Khumalo. So then in that moment where, in that instant where you're actually experiencing that kind of a violence, but also what is that actually now for somebody who's doing that, especially within the academy, the role of being in the academy, and also like functioning within the academy. What are the protocols, or rather the bureaucracy of doing these things, this kind of erasures that one is experiencing. So I think there's something to be said about it, but also like with the people who are actually doing, black writers specifically. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, there was a lot. I'm just going to jump to the point about how do we make it a truth and not an opinion, that our narratives are written into epistemological frameworks, and how then we inject this into learning and teaching as a reciprocal practice. The thing is, I don't even know, because who are we talking to, first of all, and who are we trying to convince that these are facts and not opinions? Because if we believe they are facts, who are we? Who's telling? Okay, we know who's telling us that they're opinions, but to what extent do we have to then go exercise labor to go and convince those people that, hey, actually these are facts? On the same token, I think there's I don't know, I'm just making up numbers here. There's probably more people on the planet who believe that these narratives of ours, these black narratives, are opinions than they are facts. So, I don't know, in terms of knowledge productions, I'm not too sure. I just think maybe it would also have to be understanding who we're talking to and who we're trying to convince. But it becomes difficult because I think it's a really complex thing in terms of that process of convincing.
I think some of us are kind of fortunate in terms of we are in education. Like my students, they would go and watch a play they would go and see some of the exhibitions because I would engage. I would talk about certain people that are not, when you Google them, you can't find them. So for me, I think I've got the advantage in terms of that. But as well, I think we need to, I think we are trying to make a difference in terms of history. So it all starts here. But from here, then what? You know, so we need to, from here, let us have publications, let us write, and let us change the education where, what you were saying, go back to the system of education from primary school to higher education to university, because if we don't do that, then we're gonna keep having these things and no way forward. And in terms of you, Morrison, I'm glad that you raised the fact that you spoke about the book that this man wrote about burning of churches, because currently what Ubaba Kamakuli is working on, the families that are remaining after the Sharpeville, after the 1960, which is something that people never looked into. Because we always write about this history, we always say, but then we always say, what about the people who are remaining? Because people keep taking this history, keep writing it, we use it for our thesis, we use it for our dissertations, we write about it in our own personal books, then what? People who are remaining behind, they don't benefit from it, you know? So he's going back, working with the families, trying to capture this history of Sharpeville from a different point of view, from a black point of view, from the families who are remaining behind, which for me is quite crucial. In terms of Technorama, I once tried to book Technorama for a show, and I was told that they're fully booked, again, for a wedding. So if we don't become visible and book the space and say, but how, why is it for a wedding while this is meant to be a museum? That's the only way, by writing and complaining and doing shows, because as well, it can stay for over a year, that space not being utilized, you know? Because at the moment, the current students that I'm teaching, I'm also saying, we've got Sharpeville Precinct, which is the old police station. Why don't you do your exhibitions there? Why don't you take your exhibitions at the Technorama? Because if you don't do that, these places become like a white elephant. And then in terms of Skumboso, I think it was more of a comment, but I think we'll engage with that later because I think we ran out of time.
Yeah. Maybe we'll take, are there any more questions before? Yeah? It's not a question, okay?
My name is Samloi, born and raised in the VAL. So yeah, I'm an early childhood development practitioner. So I would just want to comment on Nkululeko. Please, can I please collaborate? Because now I'm starting this teaching visual art to children that are from 3 years to 7 years old. That's what I'm doing now. So please, can I collaborate with you? That's it. Thank you.
Right, I think we have come to the end of our session. We're going to break for lunch. I'd like to thank our presenters, Simnikiwe and Nkululeko. Thank you so much for such engaging. And you can always come and speak to them during lunch, yeah.